I just want to, before we actually get into my message, I just want to echo some of the sentiments that Pastor Rob had already said. Number one, I want to thank that my parents are always up here and they're super supportive. But also, I am actually so excited for what's going on at the church this summer and having Taylor and Libby here. It's been awesome. It's been awesome, especially as I've gotten to this new role a little bit in the past number of weeks and just being here throughout the week. And it's been so cool just how busy the church has been these past couple weeks. It's like a Tuesday afternoon, and like I look out to the driveway, and there's like 7 or 8 cars here, and people are buzzing around, and it's been awesome. I've been getting excited. There's just a sense of excitement in the air here at Highway Church, and so I'm really, really looking forward to the summer and to the future, and we definitely have some good times ahead. I thought it was. Is it not? I hear me. Check, check. Testing, testing. Crispy chicken. So, as Pastor said, we are in a series called 7 Letters, and it's in the book of Revelation. And the book of Revelation was always a little bit near and dear to my heart. I was always super interested in it growing up. Now, I don't know if my parents even know this, but sometimes, I'm just going to throw something. Sometimes growing up when I was in church, so we had our own kids' churches, and around 12 years old, 11 years old, around the same age that Isaac is now, and he's not here, of course, this morning, but I started coming to the big church. And so I was really excited the first couple weeks, and then I got kind of bored of it kind of quickly. And so I used to use my Bible as my form of entertainment during service. I mean, it wasn't bad. I'm not sure if my parents know, but starting out, especially when I was younger, my Bible had a number of comics in it. And so that's pretty much what I read all the time. Instead of going and actually reading the Bible, I was just going through the comics. However, there's only so many times that you can read the same 6 comics. Gets a little dull after a while, and especially in church every week. So I started actually reading my actual Bible a little bit more, and lo and behold, I happened upon this amazing book at the end of the Bible. And it was my favorite book for the longest. Like, it was that and Daniel, because of the namesake, and I had to like Daniel. But it was so interesting, and I went through, and nowhere else in the Bible is it so almost like action-packed. It reads like a fantasy novel at some point. So there's dragons and seals and angels and blowers being pulled out and stars falling from the heavens and destroying the earth. And it was very, very fun and interesting for a 13-year-old. However, the same things that make this book so interesting to a 13-year-old are also what makes it one of the most difficult books to actually read. Because, like I said, you're going through, and we have things like the Old Testament history, and they're very literal. It's a narrative. It reads like a story. You go and you have Psalms and Proverbs, and it's just like, okay, I understand the concept. The epistles are super practical. And then right at the end, you get dragons and stars falling from the heavens. And so it's such a weird turn, and you have to be careful when you're reading it. And so as we get into, we're reading right at the beginning of 7 Letters. I'm not going to get into all the context there, but just a little bit of introduction is that there's 7 churches and letters being written to each of them, and Jesus is writing these letters. And each of them has its own sort of context, they'll have their own sort of format. But the main thing you have to remember is that the details are super important. Throughout the entire book, the details are extremely important. And so here actually is the map. I'm going to get to it in just a second. But with this, each church is interpreted different ways on top of that. So you have all these details that are important. You have the structure of the actual letters, and it starts with the introduction of Christ, and then commendation, and then rebuke, solution, consequence, and promise. And those are all there, but then each church has multiple different meanings. And so scholars take it to mean there's 4 main things it means. There was an actual church, a little church. It's both a time in history, like an era of the church. It's supposed to mean churches nowadays, and it's also supposed to be individual lives. And these are the 4 kind of applications you're supposed to apply to these things. And so I say all this to say is that it gets very, very complicated. And you need to try to pick up the details. You need to actually do a lot more research. It's harder to take it at face value. Instead, you have to sit there and you have to kind of connect all these things. And so we're on the 4th week, and it is the church in Thyatira. And so as you can see behind me on the map, Thyatira, it's right in between the cities of Pergamum and Sardis. And we've talked about those guys. And literally that is what Thyatira was known for. It kind of, when I was doing the research, I was talking to Pastor, it kind of reminded me of Haldimand County, because out of all the churches that it was written to, out of the 7 churches, Thyatira was by far the least known. It's actually the longest letter, but by far the least known. And in all the research I've done, the city was basically built because it was on the road between Sardis and Pergamum. That was the design of it. And so in my mind, I was just thinking of this road between the two is almost like Highway 6, and kind of Caledonia, Haldimand County, Hagersville. It's based around that. That's where its trades happened. And so simply because it was on the road between these 2 other cities, it started to get a little bit more, and it started to actually get a few trades. And so one of the things that Thyatira was known for was its metallurgy. And so it's making of metals. And the other thing that it was very known for was its making of purple cloths. And so if you read Acts, there was a lady named Lydia, a maker of purple cloths. It was super rare, and it was hard to make purple cloths back then. We're not going to get into the process because it's a long, boring process. But that's basically what it was known for. And you can go and you can do research, and it's basically, that's about it for Thyatira. There's even disagreements about what the name is. And when you go into the other cities, you have these big kind of ruins. If you go to the current city of Thyatira, it's in Turkey, it's called Akhisar. There's not even really ruins or archaeological digs. Just because in the grand scheme of things, it was an industrial city, but there's nothing that important there. But not to say that the church wasn't important there. And going through that, another thing that it very much reminded me of the city is that because that was sort of the industrial center, and there weren't any main buildings there, but they provided a service and a need for the community. It reminded me of Haldimand County again, and us being the breadbasket of Ontario. And on top of that, I think that kind of attitude lent its way into the attitude of the church. Because if you go through, and when we're going to get to it, when you start reading the church, it's full of good, hardworking, honest, loving people. And I think that had something to do with it. Just like if I look at our church, another comparison, when I look at us, we have an amazing church. I'm so proud of our church. Pastor Rob talks all the time, he brags all the time to other pastors about how often and how many of our congregations actually going and volunteering. How loving our church is. And I think that actually has a lot to do with the culture of where we were raised. But not only that, there's other similarities, and if you look at it, and we can actually go to the first part of the verses, and it's actually going to be in a little bit, you'll see that not only is the church hardworking, and it's a strong church, and it's a loving church, but it's actually a growing church. See, it was kind of Thyatira, it's kind of known as the opposite of Ephesus, whereas it lost that first love, and it's still kind of doing works, but it kind of lost that aspect of it. Instead, Thyatira was actually a growing church, both numerically but also spiritually. They were doing well. It was a good place to be. It was the place to be out of all the churches. So let's get to the letter, and we'll expand on that a little bit more. And so it starts off with, no, not quite yet, Joe. So it starts off, to the angel of the church of Thyatira write, these are the words of the Son of God, whose eyes are like blazing fire and whose feet are like burnished bronze. And so right there, again, part of what was being written is these are all kind of allegories and metaphors that the people there were going to understand. I mean, you have to remember Thyatira was a metallurgy city. So it's using all these metaphors and allegories that they're going to understand. And like I said, I know your deeds, your love and faith, your service and perseverance, and that you are now doing more than you did at first. Again, it's a good church. It's a place to be. They are doing well. But nevertheless, I have this against you. You tolerate that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophet. By her teaching, she misleads my servants into sexual immorality and the eating of food sacrificed to idols. Now, when we're talking about Jezebel, and we'll expand on it a little bit, people often disagree, and scholars disagree about who Jezebel was. Some say that it's actually not an actual person, it's just kind of this concept of this immorality, and some say, no, it was a lady named Jezebel. Most people believe it was an actual person who wasn't named Jezebel, but instead, John is referring to the Jezebel in the Old Testament. But as we continue, I have given her time to repent of her immorality, but she is unwilling. So I will cast on her a bed of suffering, and I will make those who commit adultery with her suffer intensely unless they repent of her ways. Continue, Joe. I will strike her children dead. And then the churches will know that I am he who searches hearts and minds, and I will repay each of you according to your deeds. Now, this is an important line, and we're going to get back to it. I am he who searches hearts and minds. Please keep that in your mind. When he's talking about their children, again, not actual literal children, he's talking about her teachings. Now I say to the rest of you in Thyatira, to you who do not hold to her teaching and have not learned Satan's so-called deep secrets, I will not impose on you any other burden on you, except to hold on to what you have until I come. Continue, Joe. To the one who is victorious and who does my will to the end, I will give authority over the nations. That one will rule them with an iron scepter and will dash them to pieces like pottery. Just as I've received authority from my Father, I will also give that one the morning star. Whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. So, again, there's a lot more metallurgy and metaphors in the end there. The iron rod, the morning star is talking about Jesus. But as much as all that's good, and as much as understanding the practicality aspect of it is good, as I said, it's not just a history lesson. It's not just about what the city was. And even with just reading it, I feel like this is the part where most people would check out. Just because even as you read on it, and when I was ever in the congregation, I would automatically assume I knew where the sermon was going. Because it talks about it, and it says it. And there's one key word that to me, as soon as I saw it, I'll be like, okay, I know where this is going. And that word's tolerate. See, at that point, if I was sitting down, I would assume I knew where we were going, because tolerate, it's kind of a buzzword nowadays. Tolerate, as soon as somebody says it, people hop onto an extreme. And people kind of go in their own minds. And so, if you say tolerate, all of a sudden you have the one extreme where people are like, oh no, we need to be apart from the world. And we need to tolerate, we can't tolerate, we need to be intolerant. And so you have that aspect of it. And then there's the other side, where there's my generation who uses tolerance, and they use tolerance as a battle cry. And then on top of that, we just had a sermon last week basically on tolerance. And even when you Google, and I was Googling a bunch of different sermons trying to do research for this, every single pastor, every single preacher that I saw, all preached on this tolerance, this idea of tolerance. 90% of the actual sermons were called the tolerant church. But I want you to go with me for a second, because I don't think that we all have the right idea of what this passage is about. And I want you to go with me, because as much as I was listening to a bunch of sermons, I want to take it just a little bit of a different direction, because as much as that is an important issue, and that is something we talked about already, I don't necessarily think that's directly what this passage is talking about. Because it's not necessarily about tolerating the world, but I would say it's about what you're going to tolerate in your own life. See, I think instead of this kind of external view of tolerance, this scripture is not talking about that. It's not talking about a separation from the world, but instead is actually an internal view. It's not about outside, but it's about what's inside of you. And the reason I say that, first and foremost, because if you look at the scripture and if you look at the history, Jezebel wasn't this outside force that they were letting come in and changing their ways. We like to kind of do this rally cry where we can't change our ways for other people, but Jezebel wasn't somebody else. Jezebel was part of the church already. And not only that, Jezebel was actually a leader in the church. She had followers. She was actually enacting change in the church. She was a leader. See, it's not about these outward issues. I don't think when it's talking about tolerance, it's not about these hot-button issues that we like to talk about. It's not parades in Toronto and, oh, he said and us and them and all this kind of antagonistic issues. That is something that we need to talk about. But we're not talking about people or how we handle situations or how we handle those sticky situations. We're talking about us. We're talking about how we deal with one of us. We're talking about how we deal with things in our own lives. And that makes sense even in the context of when you're looking at it, because I said you need to be careful with the details. You need to pay attention to the details. And so even when the introduction of Jesus, of the passage, a lot of people just kind of skip by, and the first time I read it, I skipped by it. But the more I read it, it described Jesus as the Son of God with eyes of fire. Now, this is the only time in the entire book of Revelation that it talks about Jesus as the Son of God. And right at the same time, it's talking about eyes of fire. And what eyes are for, it's for seeing. And on top of that, later on, it talks about God is He who searches and knows your heart and knows your mind. And they use this element of fire in there as well, a metaphor that they would understand. But if you're using fire, fire is used as a purification process. However, fire, it's not used to separate ore from the earth. It's not about the separation from outside. That's already happened. What fire is used for, and these eyes of fire are used to purify what's already there, so to take the impurities out of already there. And so that's what I think this passage is actually talking about. It's not about the separation from the earth, but instead it's this fire and what impurities are in the church. What are impurities are in ourselves. You see, we like focusing on the outside a lot. It's a lot easier to talk about tolerance when we're talking about outside of these walls. But it's a lot harder when we start looking inside the walls. See, now, I don't think that we necessarily have a problem with a leader inside the church. Instead, what I would put forward is that this lesson is a lot more for us on the individual level. And so the question that I wanted this entire sermon to wrap around is what is your Jezebel? Or better yet, what is my Jezebel? What do we tolerate in our own lives? What do we have in our own lives that is something that, innately we know is wrong, but we've accepted it. We've let it sit there. I mean, maybe it's a habit of sin that we've had for a long time. We struggled with it in our youth, but we never seemed to get a grasp on it. And over time, we've accepted it. It's okay. And we've let it be. Maybe it's a personality feature. Maybe it's something about your personality that at this point you're just like, it's how I've always been. You know what? Yeah. I know it's not the best thing, but that's just who I am. That's just the way I was raised. Oh, that's just my family. I'm actually reading a book that I'm going to allude to a little bit later, and the writer, it's all about being an emotionally healthy leader, and he was talking about how for the longest time in his journey, he was just okay with being disorganized and not being a proper leader that way, and he just dismissed it as that's how I've always been. Is that a Jezebel for you? Maybe it's somebody in your life, an actual person that, is unhealthy. A friend that every time you're around this one person, your personality completely changes. Every time you're around this one person, you're going to do something you regret later. Or you're going to act in a way, you're going to say things. Is that person a Jezebel in your life? What things do we know that's wrong, but you know what? We've accepted it. It's not that bad. I mean, look at all the good things we're doing. Look at all the amazing work we've done. Look how much I volunteer for the church. Look how much I give. But what is their Jezebel? What is our Jezebel? I want to take it a step further because there's actually another coin to this as well. You see, I don't think that the things we tolerate in our own lives need to be these inherently bad things either. I mean, we all know if there's a person that's a bad influence in our lives. We know that, and we kind of accept it. But I think that there's other things in our own lives that are stopping our growth, that are stopping us from being the person we want to be, that aren't inherently bad. You see, now this is my own theory. I wasn't able to verify this or anything, so don't take this as fact. But in my mind, it doesn't make sense that Jezebel was able to rise to a position of leadership, being this evil, immoral person she was, unless there was there was something good. She had to have been doing something right in order to gain this following. She had to have been doing something right in order to actually get this power in the first place. Now, I don't know whether or not that she was completely evil and under a mask of good, if that might have been it, or whether she actually had good and then kind of fall off. But I believe that in order for there to have actually been a point where people started following her, there needed to be something good, because people won't go and follow something innately evil. So whether it was deception, or whether it was just her being misguided, I think at some point, personally, there must have been something good for people to follow. And I think it's the same thing in our lives. I think the vast majority of the things we tolerate are actually things that either are disguised as good or started as good, but at some point along the way have become unhealthy. At some point along the way, they've actually stopped our growing, and that's the very thing that's stopping us from going forward. You see, they don't need to be these inherent sins, these inherent bad things, these inherent evil things. They don't need to be these deep, dark secrets that we don't tell anybody, that's only us in the night. Those things are bad too, but I think that even just a state of unhealth is just as evil. Because I think it's a tool from the enemy. Because realistically, the best way to get evil into somebody's life is to disguise it. So what things do we tolerate that may be good, but are actually stopping our growth? See, my mind immediately went back to relationships. I mean, how many relationships are in our lives, you know what, there are good parts of those relationships, but realistically it's unhealthy. I mean, as much as I can say and stand there a little bit early and talk about, that one person that isn't healthy in your life, and yeah, there are those people, then there are relationships that, you know what, you're actively trying. I mean, cutting off relationships because they're unhealthy, it seems so wrong. But are there relationships that are good, that have good in them, but are actually getting in the way? Relationships between two good people, and there's nothing wrong, and this could be friendships or romantic relationships or anyway, that as much as they're good elements, really are actually bringing a state of unhealth. What about things like work? I mean, work obviously is a good thing. I mean, we need to provide. We need to provide for ourselves. We need to be good stewards of our money. But it can get to a point where all of a sudden things like work are actually getting in the way of our growth. Things like work or money or financial security, safety are actually getting in the way of what God is calling us for. You need to be safe. You need to plan ahead. But sometimes God calls you to take risks. Sometimes God is actually wanting you to take a leap of faith instead of planning every step of the way. Sometimes God doesn't want you to be a Martha. He wants you to be a Mary. For my own generation, what about things like technology? It's an amazing thing. I was talking with Elaine this morning. Technology is an amazing thing. I'm totally forgetful, so I can put reminders all the time on my phone. It's great. Technology has connected the world like never before. I can do research with a touch of a button. I have the entire repository, basically, of human knowledge in the palm of my hand. This is an amazing thing. So much good can happen with this. I can keep in touch with my youth. I can check on people, how they're doing. I have dear friends of mine that live far away, that they're just a couple buttons away. Even social media can be used as a very, very strong thing. It can be used for a lot of good. It can be used to reach out. But sometimes this can also be a barrier to what we need to go forward in life. Just as there is the entire repository of the human existence of knowledge and a lot of good things and books and things available at the touch of a button, there are also a lot of extremely unsightly things that I'm able to access just as easily, if not more easily, from this device of mine. And not even as invasive, even just being distracted. I know so many people that are addicted to these things. And all of a sudden, all the mothers in the audience get super happy because I said that. But no, it is true. What about people who are not only addicted to these things, but I know a lot of people who are addicted to their own social media presence. Unfortunately, I know a lot of pastors who care more about how many likes they get on a post than about some of their kids sometimes. That as much as they're good people and they do good works, you can tell intrinsically that, you know what, part of their motive is how they look over social media. Again, another good thing that might have some evil, that might have some unhealth disguised in it. What about things like traditions in the church? I mean, as much as I'm able to pick on my generation, maybe there are traditions in the church, things that we hold on to. But you know what? If we were really honest with ourselves, aren't exactly biblical. That if we're really honest with ourselves, as good as they are and as effective as they are, now they actually get in the way of the church going forward, in the way of the church growing, in the way of reaching people for Jesus. See, there are good things that can stop us from growing, but that we hold on to. And I'm going to be bold for a second. Because as much as I talked before about how there's these habits of sin and aren't these bad things, realistically, if we know inherently that something is holding us back, and we choose not to get rid of that, if we know that something, as much as there's good part of it, but there's also bad, and we hold on to that, that's sin. See, in our minds, we like to do this kind of this, like, the good kind of outweighs the bad, but that's not how the Bible works. It's not how Jesus works. See, we all know, and we all like to talk about how Jesus, when he talked about it, he said if your hand causes you to sin, it's better to chop it off. If your eye causes you to sin, it's better to pluck it out. And we'll talk about that, but we don't like actively doing it. Because in our mind, our hand has so good, but our technology has so good, but this relationship, I know if I stuck it a little bit longer in the relationship, it might, but Jesus says to cut it off. And it's just not something I think we're willing to do. We're not brought up that way. In fact, I'm pretty sure that my generation would be a lot more willing to chop off their hand than to get rid of this. And it works. I mean, realistically, I can use this with one hand. It works. I mean, personally, I'd be partial to the eye poking out. Just got a little eye patch. I'm a pirate. I got one laugh. I'll take that. It's pirates. Pirates are awesome. What I think this passage is about, it's about introspection. It's about taking a second and taking a deep look inside. See, God often wants us to call us higher. God wants to call us to a greater place. God wanted to call Thyatira to a greater place, and they were doing so much already, and he wanted to give them more, but there was something holding them back. And the problem is that they weren't willing to deal with the thing holding them back. And so the question is what do we tolerate in our own lives? And it's tough. And it's a tough question. And I get it that I'm saying here, you know what? It's a lot harder in reality to deal with. Introspection is difficult. It's tough. It takes courage. It's much easier. It's much more comfortable to look at others and to judge them, but to not really ever look at ourselves. See, I alluded to it earlier, this book that I'm reading called The Emotionally Healthy Leader. And the very first section is called Facing Your Shadow. And he talks about, he likes using fancy words, I mean, he's a writer. But the shadow are these things in your life that are holding you back, that you may be aware of or you may not be aware of. These things that drag you down, that rear their ugly heads sometimes when you're not looking at things that get in your way of growing. And he said that you need to address these things first. The very first step is to address these shadows, is to bring them to light, is to take a spotlight and look in the deep, dark crevices of your own heart. Because without an understanding of yourself, without an understanding of what's holding you back, you can never, ever move forward. And it is tough. And unfortunately, in today's culture, it's extremely rare. People don't like to take these tough looks. People don't like to ask these tough questions. It is uncomfortable. I have a very good friend of mine, a dear friend. Grew up in the church, amazing, amazing girl. And she's currently living with her boyfriend. And I talked to her often, and we were talking, and we were even talking about faith. And she mentioned how she still has this vibrant faith in her. I was like, oh, okay. And she was talking about how whenever she's feeling rough, whenever she's bogged down, if she's stressed, God is the first person she goes to. And about how she was talking, and I think she got a little bit proud for a second, because she was even talking about how she thinks that, you know what, sometimes her faith might be even stronger than the people in the church that would criticize her lifestyle. And so I was like, okay. And then I simply asked her, I was like, I get that, and I'm glad that you still reach out to God, but how does that jive in your head with how you're living? Like, you say you have this relationship with God, but what do you think He thinks about your situation? And she basically, her response was that she just doesn't think about it, because there is no response. I was talking to her later on, and she came to this crisis moment, and she was considering going to church, and her reason why she didn't want to go back to church was because she said she knew if she went, she would feel guilty enough about her living situation that she would probably break up with her boyfriend. And so she avoided going to church. Even though there were things that she needed, she wanted to go. She felt safe there. She even says she feels at home in churches. But she's literally avoiding it because she didn't want to deal with those tough questions. And unfortunately, I wish I could say that hers was an isolated incident, because I see the same thing so often. And I have enough of a relationship with her that I can talk about it openly and freely, but I have so many more friends that I know that I can see in the same situation. And they avoid the tough questions. See, despite how rare asking these tough questions, despite how rare introspection is, it's actually super important. It's important enough to be the first book. It's important enough that God decided to take time, and out of a church that was doing everything right, He decided, hey, you need to check yourself. Are we willing to cut off something that's good for the sake of the better? Are we willing to get rid of something good for the sake of the better? But I do have good news, and despite how doom and gloomy it is, there is one bright spot of good news. And that is, thankfully, in each and every one of us, we know He who searches heart and mind. We know the Son of God with eyes like fire. And I think that it's perfect that it's Communion Sunday, because that's exactly what communion is about. It's about this consecration. It's about this purifying. That's why Jesus did it. We talk about the Son of God with eyes of fire, this purifying fire. Are we willing to take the gold that we are and go through the fire that sucks in order to come out pure and more refined? It's not a fun process. It feels like being burned alive. But is it worth it to come out as gold? Because God, in the same passage that talked about this, it also talked about our reward, and that we'd have authority over the nations. We'd have influence in our community. And isn't that what the church is about? Isn't that why we're here? Are we here for a get out of hell free card? Or are we here to actually make a difference in this world? Are we here just for an end goal, or are we here for the now? Are we here to reach the community? to make Haldeman a better place, to bring people to Christ. Because God gave us the recipe for it. He said, hold on. Hold on to Him and not these things. Hold on to Him and not what's second best. See, I think we need to be a little less tolerant. And I don't mean necessarily outwardly, but inwardly. See, because I think God is calling us, both as individuals and as a church, to a higher place. And I'm excited to see what influence we can have in this community if we have the courage to let go and to hold fast to God, to follow His lead, to be intolerant.